下面我们这个邀请到是Professor Eric Nelson 他是美国这个麻州 Buber 这个大学的哲学系的教授。那他的研究呢也是非常的广泛包括这个基督教圣经的解释伦理学，还有自然的哲学然后也包括这个我们中国道家的这个思想的研究。那他发表了很多的这个期刊，还有专书在这方面的研究。OK， 所以他今天给我们带来的题目是科技和道就中国的这个中国的这个道家的思想就科技和道还有这个布伯海德格的这个和道家的思想比较好，谢谢我们。现在我们来欢迎 Professor Eric Nelson。
Hello. It's very nice to be here in Taiwan. I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation to present here, especially as my primary area of research is in European, especially German and Jewish philosophy. I'm also very interested in Eastern philosophy and religion, especially Daoism, Chinese Daoism, and Buddhism. And my current research project is on the topic of the reception of Chinese thought in the context of German philosophy. So this paper is part of a larger project that I hope to finish this year or maybe next year. And of course, it's a very dangerous thing to talk about comparative intercultural philosophy because it is strewn and full of misinterpretations, misunderstandings. And of course, many experts in Daoism would say that Martin Buber, Martin Heidegger, they don't know Chinese, they don't know these traditions very well, so what do they have to say about Daoism? And this is why I have Daoism in parentheses, to emphasize the fact that their vision of Daoism is something that they formed through translations, through their own philosophical agendas. But I think even though that's the case, that they're providing their own agendas and approaching Eastern wisdom, they still are finding something there that you might say is genuinely Chinese, and not just something they projected upon it. And so in this paper, I'm considering the role of Zhuangzi, to a lesser extent Lao Tzu, how it's taken up in early 20th century German philosophy in the context of dealing precisely with the questions we're facing in this conference. The question of modern science and modern technology, and whether they're compatible with a more holistic, more authentic way of existing. Because the interesting thing about the reception of Daoism in early 20th century German philosophy, even though we might say it's full of misunderstandings, is that it's really focused on this issue, whether there can be an alternative to a technological way of life, whether we can think of science in a broader context, where we can live more generally in relationship to nature and perhaps to our spiritual reality as well. So unfortunately, I won't do this paper in Chinese, but in English. But you can follow along. The Chinese version is on page 97 in the text. And I also will skip the first section, which is more about this dilemma between free and open communication between different cultures, which is a great thing, but involves a lot of misunderstandings because it does not bring in the expertise that might be needed. But on the other hand, there's also the danger of a certain set of experts interpreting things without allowing communication to occur. So in both of these cases, there is not a genuine encounter between a German or European or Western thinker and a Chinese thinker. And of course, this is a problem not only on the side of European thinkers interpreting Chinese thinkers, such as Heidegger and Zhuangzi, but also it's a problem that people say of Chinese thinkers who interpret Western thinkers, say Mo Tsen-San's interpretation of Kant, Many Kant scholars would say it's very much a Chinese interpretation, not what Kant actually said. But I think these kinds of engagements are still something necessary, even though they might involve these kinds of misunderstandings. So the first section I want to read to you is about the Hasidic Zhuangzi, which might sound very unusual to you, because mostly you think of Chinese philosophy. Hello? Is it working? Chinese philosophy in relationship to, say, Christianity or to Western secular thinking. But there's very little you often think that connects, say, something like Judaism, Jewish thought, with Chinese thought. But as a matter of fact, there's actually a very interesting and rich reception of Chinese philosophy in the Jewish tradition, specifically when we look at a figure like Martin Buber. So on the one hand, you might say someone like Franz Rosenzweig was very critical of Chinese thought as a form of paganism. You might read the Star of Redemption and say there's obviously no sympathy or understanding of the Chinese spiritual situation. But someone like Buber shows that this is possible. So he's approaching Zhuangzi through a tradition called Hasidic Judaism. And Hasidic Judaism comes from the word Hasid, which means in modern Hebrew piety, but actually the root is something very Buddhistic because it means loving kindness. And it's a form of Judaism that emphasizes not simply the transcendence of humanity or God outside of the world, as Martin mentioned in his previous talk, but rather that there's a human role within the world, that humans are participants in the order of the world, but also that the divine, God, is within the world as well. So Heidegger's familiarity with the Daoism and the Zhuangzi in German translation has been frequently noted. Heidegger is reported to have repeatedly read Martin Buber's 1910 edition of selections from the Zhuangzi, which is called the Reden und Gleichnisse des Zhuangzi, the speeches and parables of Zhuangzi, which Buber translated actually from English translations of James Lega and Herbert von Giles into German, published with Insel Verlag in 1910. There's been much discussion of the few passages where Heidegger evokes early Taoist images and ideas. Little attention has, however, been devoted to how Heidegger's brief allusions to and uses of Taoist ideas, images, and metaphors might be shaped by his sources. And there's good reason to reconsider this context for both historical and present philosophical reasons. First, Buber's edition of the Zhuangzi cannot in any way be understood as a neutral medium representing the Zhuangzi text to German readers. It intentionally and selectively focuses on the poetic and narrative presentation of ideas in the Zhuangzi. Secondly, Buber's edition contains a long afterword that makes his own interpretation of the Zhuangzi explicit. There, he develops the continuity and the transformation of what he calls the Lehre des Weges, the teaching of the Tao, Daojiao, into what he considers its fullest actualization in Zhuangzi. So unlike what he considers to be the more monistic, elemental, mystical, and anti-linguistic presentation of the teaching of the Tao in Lao Tzu, the teaching of the Way is enacted through a more indirect, more playful, more humorful, and more poetic dialogical language in the Zhuangzi. So what appears as inhuman and what he calls monstrous in the Tao Te Ching appears more human in the stories of the Zhuangzi, even when they concern animals rather than human beings. So the teaching of the Way is realized more communicatively in and through language, and thus more genuinely and more fully, according to Buber. So Buber's vision of Zhuangzi is of a sage who resembles in certain respects the Hasidic rabbis of Eastern Europe, of whom Buber also wrote in this period. In fact, intriguingly enough, Buber's earliest works are translations and interpretations of either Hasidic texts or Chinese texts. Buber's edition of Chinesische Geister und Liebesgeschichten, Chinese Ghost and Love Stories, published in 1911, is a translation from English to German of a collection of stories drawn from Hu Sonling's strange stories from a Chinese studio. These strange stories of seductive fox spirits, angry ghosts, corrupt Confucian scholars, Buddhist monks, and Taoist exorcists reveal aspects of the Tao refracted through the popular imagination, akin to the Hasidic storyteller. The Hasidic master is the Eastern European teacher of Judaism who teaches the spiritual, not through doctrine or dogma, but through evocatively enacting and living the symbolic in story, song, poetry, and even dance. So in the exemplary cases of Chinese and Hasidic teaching, therein, Jiao, parable, according to Buber, teaches more primordially than doctrine or theory. The parable is the engagement of the absolute into the world of things, he writes. The poetic and narrative enactment of the teaching is thus more fundamental than either its doctrinal or theoretical presentation, or its being hidden in silence and the ineffable. Its communication is in fact the teaching itself. So much like the Hasidic narrators of Yiddish tales of the Golem, the wandering Jew, magic-wielding protective rabbis who protect the Jewish community from dangers, the Debuk, a malevolent lost soul who possesses the young and the innocent, shape-shifting and talking beasts, and even tales of Gilgul or reincarnated souls. Popular Chinese tales such as those of Pu Song Ling communicate the uncanny sensibility to the evocative image and the effective word. And in both cases, we see the nearness, the proximity, the communication between the spiritual realm and the earthly realm, which is what Buber found so fascinating both in Chinese culture and also in Hasidic culture as well. There's not a dualistic separation between the divine and human, but rather they are in constant interaction. And fox spirits and ghosts and other such things are exemplars of that interaction. So Buber's Zhuangzi teaches through surprising biological reversals, strange and unusual stories of humans, animals, and spirits, and most importantly through humor and laughter. The affective and non-cognitive dimension proves to be a more fundamental way of addressing and shifting the mood, the ethos, the way of living of the listener or of the reader. So reversing typical criticisms of the Zhuangzi as an escape and withdrawal from the world, Buber's Zhuangzi fulfills the teaching of the Tao by playfully returning the Tao to the world itself. And it does this through words, through images that teach through parable lessons to ordinary life itself. And within that ordinary life, this is where free and easy wandering, Xiaoyayo, that Professor Cohn talked about earlier, is supposed to occur. So Buber contrasts Zhuangzi's imminent liberation within the world with the seriousness and what he considers the almost inhuman endorsement of silence that he finds expressed in the Daoism, which of course he continued to appreciate, even translating sections of the Daoism into Hebrew in the early 1940s in Jerusalem. So both early Taoist texts, both the Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi texts, respond, Buber writes, to the needful in human existence. The needful can only be realized in the wholeness of this worldly life, that is, in the sensual life and truthful life of the Zhenran, of the perfected person. Maurice Friedman, one of Buber's commentators, describes Buber's vision of the perfected person, the Zhenran, as the one who harmonizes the greatest transformations with the fullest and utmost unity. In a description that captures an element of both Judaism and perhaps Taoism as well, Buber concludes that to be one with the Tao is constantly to renew creation and life in the everyday, the ordinary, and the mundane. In this sense, Taoism is not the anti-ethical or nihilistic philosophy that some modern proponents and critics conceive of it. It is rather a deeply ethical teaching of the good that through its notions of non-doing, wu wei, and non-interfering, and not harming the life of others, warns against separation from and destruction of creation. So Buber Zhuangzi suggests a more fundamental teaching than the flights and fancies of otherworldly mysticism, as this genuine unity is achievable only immanently or internally in the midst of the dynamic changes of human life and natural life as well. So this point also indicates how Zhuangzi transformed and perfected Lao Tzu's teaching of the way. The Daoism responds to the needful in terms of a silent contemplation of a unitary mystical unity, or at least so Buber says. It is the elemental, yet he writes the elemental is not yet the fulfilled or the perfected. It is a life of solitude and concealment in which Lao Tzu does not talk with others, but only with and to concealment itself. In contrast to this hiddenness and incompleteness that Buber sees in the Lao Tzu text, the Zhuangzi fulfills the needful within the everyday, ordinary existence through the more dynamic, playful, and transformative oneness and multiplicity that they can taught only through what he calls complete speech. And the most complete form of speech is not the theoretical proposition or a scientific statement, but rather it is what he calls the parable. And great teachers of the parable that he finds are Zhuangzi, but also the Buddha, the historic Buddha, who often taught through parable, and of course the early Jesus, before Jesus becomes myth. So the playing of oneness in multiplicity is Buber's gloss on the music of panpipes of heaven, for example. Here, the oneness of the world is at the same time the oneness of each singular thing that can only be considered from out of itself. And the way is not distinct then from each unique or singular thing in which it happens, or is enacted. Each thing rather manifests Tao to the way of its existence through its very life. So the love of things articulated in the Tao teaching embraces and nourishes life in each thing and releases these things through non-doing, Wu Wei. In surrendering, the perfected person, the Zhen Ren, renews creation. Here Buber, of course, anticipates, and perhaps, I would argue, influenced Heidegger's language when he addresses what he considers to be Daoism, renouncing violence against things, a violence that is distinctive of modern Western science and technology. Wu Wei, quote, helps all beings to their freedom and redeems them out of the slavery of violence and machinery. That is, in this quotation, we see that in Taoist Wu Wei, we see an alternative, the violence done against things that is characteristic of the modern scientific and technological attitude that has gained such prominence in Western civilization. So Taoism is not simply a historical fact for Buber, it is something that reveals an alternative way of life, one that still has something to say to us, something fundamental to say to us today, because it precisely speaks to what is needful in human existence. So in the next section, I consider whether Taoist Wu Wei can be a kind of response to technological modernity, the modern scientism, as Buber and later Heidegger both suggest. So Buber returned to the burden, what he calls the burden of modern science and technology, in a paper he gave in Frankfurt at the China Institute in 1928 called China und Wir, China and Us. In his discussion of whether ancient Chinese wisdom offers a genuine, attainable alternative for modern European civilization, he argued for the impossibility of Europeans escaping the burden of technological modernity. There is for Buber, quote, no going behind all this industrializing and technicizing and mechanizing. Because without technological modernity, European civilization would in fact lose its own specific Tao, he writes. It would have no Tao if it was without these very things that are part of its essence. So we, modern Europeans, he means here, would no longer proceed on the way at all, we would, in general, no longer have a way. So Western civilization without technology, without science, would deny something that is fundamental to its character. So in this sense, there's no escaping the fact of science, the fact of technology. But then the question becomes, what do we do with that fact? What do we do with the fact of industrialization, of technology, of the scientific attitude? What's our comportment? How does it become part of our life? So Buber contends then that modern Europeans cannot escape technology and science, nor should they desire to abandon these as they have become integral to the path itself, as it has been undertaken. And of course they provide for much improvement of our physical and intellectual existence. Nevertheless, Buber perceived a modern civilization that is deep in chaos and deep in crisis. This Europe is one that is infected by irrationality and tempted by power and what he calls strong leaders. This, of course, is written in 1928. And so this Europe, the one in crisis, in the face of the irrational and in the face of power and the lust for power, is in need of hearing what he calls an elemental teaching from China. Europeans, Westerners, he argues, need to learn something to temper and contest the relentless drive for instrumental power over things found in modern Western civilization and embodied most clearly in modern Western science and technology. So Buber maintains in this lecture, China and Us, that it is difficult to imagine any experience that can challenge the modern Western conception of life as the exercise of the will to power and a relentless struggle for existence. Yet, he says, another path is needed. It expresses the needful in human life. It expresses something that is genuine in human life. And this is indicated, he says, in the writings of Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi. It is precisely the Taoist concept of Wu Wei, of non-doing, which Buber interprets as a kind of non-coercive and responsive doing. This is the key experience and conception that Europe can learn from China in order to temper its thirst for power and its lust to dominate things and other people. Wu Wei can teach a humanity consumed by technological and historical success, that such success comes with heavy costs in human suffering. So inspired by his encounter with these texts of Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi in English translation, Buber concludes that success can in fact be lost. It can be the loss of what is most needful in human existence, the loss of genuine life, and in fact, non-success can be its most genuine realization. So he writes in a quotation that we should maybe consider in full. I believe that we can receive from China in a living manner something of the Taoist teaching of Wu Wei, the teaching of Lao Tzu. And for the reason that bearing our burden on our way, we have learned something analogous, only negatively on the reverse side, so to speak. We have begun to learn, namely, that success is of no consequence. We have begun to doubt the significance of historical success, that is, the validity of the person who sets an end for himself, carries this end into effect, accumulates the necessary means and power, and succeeds with these means of power. So the typical modern Western man, I say, will begin to doubt the content of existence of this man. So there's a deep crisis of what it means to be human in the modern Western technological world. And where might a European or Westerner find a resource to recover what is human, genuinely human in human existence? Well, it's shown precisely through the non-success emphasized precisely in the text of Zhuangzi. So it is this locus, this location, the encounter between Chinese wisdom and European reality becomes possible, but is also necessary. This encounter and learning experience cannot occur, he says, through Confucian philosophy. Buber argues Confucian philosophy is too morally idealistic for modern European sensibilities, because it's focused on moral ideas rather than confronting the lust for power and success seen in modern Europe. Secondly, it is impossible to realize in the European context because Confucian ethics presupposes a particular culturally rooted understanding of family connections and relationships, like the many words for uncle that you explained yesterday. And also, there's a lack of sensibility about the relationship between the living and the dead in Western civilization. Finally, he says it is inadequate to the fundamental problematic of modern European civilization, the relentless drive for accumulation and consumption. So if Confucian ethics cannot address it, what wisdom can? Well, it's precisely this abandonment of success, of desire, of lust, of consumption, of accumulation. So what is needful in the modern Western context is precisely a teaching that pulls the egotistical, the fractured and dispersed modern self out of its absorption in frantic activities, ravenous consumption, and its compulsive obsession for success. Many things that Lydia expressed in her paper. The teaching that addresses the need of modern humanity would allow the self to become itself, to be itself as well as with others and the myriad things with which it interacts. This is something that Buber says is deeply Chinese and is something revealed through Lao Tzu and Zhuang Tzu's teaching. He writes, "And there we come into contact with something genuine and deeply Chinese, but not, to be sure, Confucian. With the teaching that genuine affecting is not interfering, not giving vent to power, but remaining within oneself. This is the powerful existence that does not yield to historical success. That is the success that can be exploited and registered in this hour, but only yields that affecting that at first appears insignificant, indeed invisible, yet endures across generations, and there at times becomes perceptible in another form. As the core of each historical success hides the turning away from what the man who accomplished it really had in mind. Not realization, but hidden non-realization that has been disguised or masked just through success in the essence of historical success. That is, again, the Taoist teaching is the only one that fundamentally puts into question the idea that success is the unconditional goal or aim of human existence. And this is precisely the power of its non-power, the usefulness of its uselessness, you might say. So another vision of living and nourishing human life is revealed in these early Taoist sources. Buber considered these both the opposite of and also a significant correction to the compulsive drive for and the instrumental calculation of success. So opposed to it stands the changing of men that takes place in the absence of success, the changing of men to the fact that one affects without interfering. It is in the commencing knowledge of this action without doing, action through non-action, of this powerfulness of existence that we can have contact with the greatest wisdom of China. So Buber concludes this discussion of this passage by noting how it is suffering and foolishness, and with an uncanny foreboding of the pending disaster that would soon swallow Europe and the world in National Socialism and the Second World War, which has brought Europe on the verge of its own self-produced abyss and the need to discover for itself precisely the wisdom of Wu Wei. With us, this knowledge then does not originate as wisdom, but as foolishness. We obtain a taste of it in the bitterest of manners, indeed in a downright foolish manner. But there where we stand, or there where we shall soon stand, we shall directly touch upon the reality of which Lao Tzu spoke. So numerous moments in Martin Heidegger's thought have been associated with Daoism in a vast and rich secondary literature that I won't discuss here. Some examples of this are the notion of Gelassenheit, the letting, releasement of things, in a kind of poetic dwelling, in contrast to the technological domination of things as mere objects of use, or the uselessness that places conventional conceptions of instrumental use and purpose into question. So many of these themes that we find in Heidegger's reading of Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi, in fact, have their counterparts in Buber's more humanistic and personalistic interpretation of Zhuangzi as a poet of the liberation of humans and things in response to what is most needful in existence and its healing power. Likewise, Heidegger's identification of technology with the essence of modern Western civilization, which he interpreted as the culmination of the unique metaphysical history of being, the West, we call Seinsgeschichte, as its rough equivalent, as we've seen, in Buber's own critique of modern technology that we saw, for example, in his essay, China and Us. But there are important differences that remain. Whereas Heidegger drew on the more abstract metaphysical imagery of empty vessels and empty spokes from the Daoism, and also the idea of uselessness of the useful, the Zhuangzi, Buber embraces Zhuangzi's more colorful, vibrant, and humorous side, you might say. His bestiary of animals, talking trees, and the concrete images of natural phenomena are things that Buber tends to that are not visible in Heidegger's interpretation. So while Heidegger pointed or posited an abyss between human life and animal life, we see in this Jewish thinker, in fact, a continuity, mutuality, and reversibility of the human and the animal. And we see these, for example, in the stories and parables of Zhuangzi. So here we see Buber emphasizing the continuity, the relationality of the human and the natural world. And we could even see the human in Buber's reading of Zhuangzi from non-human perspectives, from the perspective of fish, for example, which is something that Heidegger mentions at a point but seems inconsistent with his philosophical position. So in stories of talking trees and animals, metaphor and parable are more primary in teaching the truthful life than the cognitive or theoretically formulated principles demanded by the modern scientific and technological world. As one of Buber's Berlin teachers, Wilhelm Dilthey, stressed, the poetic is more expressive, evocative, and transformative of the fundamental facts of human existence, its moods, its dispositions, its attunements. This is then more fundamental than any kind of metaphysical language. So Buber's language of the needful, of the poetic, and the priority of the non-cognitive, affective teaching of the way, Daojiao, that realizes transformational transcendence in the midst of the immanence of everyday life, suggests one way of contextualizing and complicating interpretations of the role of Taoist Wu Wei Saran in early 20th century German readings of Taoism, particularly in Heidegger. So Heidegger noted in his letter on humanism that we are still far from pondering the essence of action decisively enough. He too wants to put into question the emphasis on action and activity that he sees as characteristic of modern Western civilization. And of course, one of the most visible alternatives, the emphasis on activism and activity, is of course, you come across a Taoist text, even in translation, talking about Wu Wei, non-doing. So Heidegger too says we need to look at the question of doing, not simply from the perspective of doing, but rather from the perspective of non-doing. And this, of course, is very evocative then of the Taoist experience of reality. So against the activism and striving and struggling of the konatas, the subject, the will, the power, that he sees as essential to the Western metaphysical tradition, Heidegger calls for the essence of action to be thought from a dimension of letting, releasement, Gelassenheit, and of powerlessness, Unmacht, that resonates with and is no doubt in part informed by Heidegger's acquaintance with and fascination with the texts of Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi. Moreover, this letting be, Lassen, and releasing into the openness of being serves as the basis of Heidegger's response to what he considers to be the essence of modern technology, which he identifies with what he calls enframing, Gestalt. That is, that there's a world picture that has become fixated and reified, in which all the myriad things become reified objects of calculation, of instrumental reasoning. So enframing Gestalt is the narrowing of the world to one impoverished world picture or perspective. So rather than having the multiplicity of perspectives that one sees in the stories and parables of Zhuangzi, one has one fixed worldview that is unchanging, that stays the same no matter what it has to deal with, whether it's turning nature into resources of use or turning human beings into human resources of use. So this attitude of enframing promotes the calculability, the producibility, the ordering of things, as it is coercively and reductively transformed into objects of what he calls standing reserve, Bestand. So what he's basically saying here is that even humans, in turning the world into mere useful objects, they turn themselves into mere useful objects. And this, for him, is the essence of modern Western civilization. So what then is the significance of the Zhuangzi and of Buber and Heidegger's interpretation of early Daoism for addressing our current condition and plight? That is the condition of modernity and the preeminence of science and technology, which these two authors, to varying degrees, say has led to an increasing calculative organization and even impersonal neutralization of reality in human life. I'd like to sketch out here a few answers before we conclude. First, there's an apparent problematization of conventional notions of utility, usefulness, purposiveness that they both see in the Zhuangzi text. The reversal of perspective that throws the dominant conception of the useful and purposeful into question becomes a key point in both of their readings of the Zhuangzi and in the subsequent German reception of the Zhuangzi as well. If you think of someone like Buber or Buber. So this historical process linked an ancient Chinese text with modern life philosophical and existentialist tendencies in German philosophy that continues today in Western philosophers who interpret Zhuangzi perhaps as an irrationalist or even as a countercultural rebel against the discipline of conventional social life. And these images of Zhuangzi are still very popular with my students, for example, whenever I teach Chinese philosophy. Secondly, it is precisely the skeptical questioning seen in the Zhuangzi, as well as its emancipatory or liberatory, poetic, and spiritual character that offer European thinkers like Buber and Heidegger hints at a more appropriate response to the crisis of scientific technological modernity. European philosophy and literature since the 19th century has been concerned with the loss of meaning and purpose that is understood as a typical experience of modern life, beginning with Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Dostoevsky. So beginning in particular with the German sociologist Max Weber, modernity has been associated with the categories of disenchantment of the world and the universalizing of an instrumental, means-oriented rationality. This rationality has been identified with the dominance of technological rationality, which is seen as reducing all ends to questions of means, and turns all the myriad things into objects of use and exploitation. So in contrast to this calculation of things, Buber and Heidegger find a kind of poetic spirituality that is resistant to this reductive notion of purposiveness. And they find this precisely in the useless trees, the playing fish, and also the disfigured bodies of the Zhuangzi. So Zhuangzi consequently becomes part of their critical encounter and confrontation with modernity and its determination by technology, science, and this category of instrumental cognitive rationality. And this in a sense is how Zhuangzi, apparently an ancient thinker from China, becomes part of modern German philosophical discourse, how he becomes a European philosopher as well as a Chinese philosopher. Third, The Zhuangzi provided these two thinkers with a model of spiritual freedom that did not signify a return to a dogmatic religiosity or monistic mysticism, which they both said they rejected. The Zhuangzi instead is conceived as a poetic way of opening up the world in order to dwell intimately and playfully in the world. So this free and easy wandering, xiao yao you, with the myriad things, promises to liberate and release one's own self, one's own life, as well as the life of things, allowing each to be itself as it is, in contrast with the modern Western civilization that has produced the egotistical domination of things in the name of freedom and happiness of an isolated, atomistic individual self. So there are two other points I want to make that distinguish Buber and Heidegger in relationship to Zhuangzi and a relationship to modern technology as well. So fourth, in the case of Buber, the Zhuangzi text indicates a dialogical and communicatively mediated spirituality that is to be distinguished from what he considered the monistic, elemental, and anti-linguistic incarnation of the teaching that he associated with Lao Tzu. But if we look at Heidegger's reading of Daoism, we might notice that Heidegger's is much closer to Buber's vision of Lao Tzu than to Zhuangzi. Because in Heidegger, we see this appreciation of silence, of a kind of inhuman silence and solitude, which, interestingly enough, Buber also articulates in his critique of Heidegger beginning in the 1930s. So by philosophizing through words, similes, parables, Zhuangzi, in fact, brings the teaching of the Tao to life, brings the Tao Jiao back to ordinary life in a way that for Buber parallels the playful storytelling of Hasidic rabbis of Eastern Europe, as I mentioned earlier. So Buber would interpret Heidegger's philosophy as being closer to the spirit of Lao Tzu than the Zhuangzi. Fifth, in Buber's portrayals of examples drawn from Taoist and Hasidic sources, the poetic, effective word has priority over the cognitive proposition in what he calls the authentic teaching of the needful, of genuine life. This is a focus that is still evident in Heidegger, who also stresses the affective dimensions of human existence. Still, Buber is much more moderate in his conclusions than Heidegger was. The priority of the affective leads Buber to contextualize rationality and warn against the danger of rejecting reason that he saw as a symptom of the crisis of modernity beginning in the late 1920s in the context of the rise of National Socialism. But of course, we see in Heidegger a much more fundamental critique and perhaps even a rejection of the notion of reason, which Buber considers very dangerous. So, Buber also does not want us to radically reject or negate science, technology, or even the neutralizing, objectifying perspective of I and it that it presupposes. So even in works like I and Tao, where Buber criticizes the loss of this I-Thou relationship in modern life, he still says the features of modernity, of impersonality and technology have to be incorporated into the context of the I-Thou relationship rather than displaced or rejected. And many critics see in Heidegger a more dangerous rejection of science, technology, and reason that Buber would not have shared. And in fact, Buber is critical of this radicality of Heidegger's message. But of course, the Heideggerian response would be that only a radical confrontation with science, technology can truly confront the problem. That maybe Buber remains too moderate in relationship to this crisis of modernity. So Buber maintains the priority of the personal, and the priority of the personal means to revive the human while not fleeing for the machine by placing science and technology in the wider biological, interpersonal context of human life. And to conclude, in this sense, he shares an insight with another personalistic, but in this case a secular Jewish thinker from Germany, Helmut Plessner, who wrote, and this is on page 95 of the text, escaping from machines and returning to the fields is not possible. They do not release us, and we do not release them. with a mysterious power, machines are inside us, and we are inside them. We have to follow the law of the machines until they themselves show us the limits of the domination of nature. So in Buber and in Plessner, we see this idea that somehow we have to integrate technology, nature, and personal experience. But even though they seem very antagonistic in modernity, the way of overcoming this problem and this crisis is not to reject one element in favor of the other, to say that we should get rid of the artificial and return to the natural. But rather, we have to realize the naturalness of the artificial and the artificialness of the natural. And this is precisely why Plessner called humans the artificial animal. The animal that makes things, that creates things, that produces things. This is part of the Tao of what it means to be human. So thank you very much. 谢谢。
非常感谢Eric Nelson 他做的介绍。今天介绍两位德国的哲学家Buber 跟Heidegger 他们对中国道家跟庄子的一些认识然后他讲到这些思想有没有可能被一些欧洲人接受？我想我们大家可能会不见得很了解西方哲学它怎么样去看我们东方的思想所以我们下午有高峰论坛，明天还有圆桌会议所以我们可以把我们的问题到下午的时候再讨论。我想我们今天早上这3个演讲就到这边圆满结束。非常再一次谢谢Eric Nelson。今天上午就到这边结束，好，谢谢各位。